picked a daiquiri because it's my comfort drink, and you might want to grab a comfort drink too, because this one's gonna get pretty heavy. The first time anyone publicly asked the Jewish question was earlier than you might expect. The Jewish Naturalization Act, passed by British Parliament in 1753, aimed to better integrate the Jews of Britain by allowing them to apply for naturalized citizenship. This was a dramatic shift from centuries of brutal, oppressive violence. The Magna Carta, the founding document of England's constitutional monarchy, excludes Jews from the rights and protections provided under the agreement. 75 years after its signing in 1290, King Edward signed the Edict of Expulsion, banning all Jews from the island. That edict was not repealed until 1657. The government wasn't necessarily motivated by a desire for greater tolerance in passing the Naturalization Act, but rather by an acknowledgement of an economic reality. Since English Jews were excluded from the feudal system William the Conqueror founded all the way back in 1066, they were autonomous subjects of the crown, meaning that although they did not live under the yoke of the feudal system by the right of their birth, they were not afforded any legal protections by the state. The Jewish community had to get food and shelter somehow, so they became merchants and traders. Christian doctrine at the time expressly forbade lending money for profit, so the Jewish community supplied that demand. Prejudice against Jewish people and populations was an assumed norm in medieval Europe. Jews were blamed for the Black Death and murdered en masse in several Christian kingdoms. The people of England had been trained to revile Jews for centuries, as the government continued to, at best, ignore the ongoing violence, although often it was the government itself perpetuating the violence. Leading up to the passing of the Act, English conservatives railed against the growing movement for accepting Jewish populations into the country. According to some writers, Christian doctrine at the time said that the Jews returning to England would bring about the apocalypse, and that belief spread far and set deep in a hyper-religious England. The bill wasn't really going to bring about a massive change to the nation of England. According to Princeton professor emeritus Lionel Gossman, the purpose of the act was really only to bring in the Jews who could afford it. The few who really had become wealthy, powerful merchants would be granted admission to the country following their application to Parliament, while the rest would be turned away. Even at the peak of anti-Jewish hatred in England, there were only about 2,000 Jews on the whole island. They did not hold political power, they did not hold religious authority, and they suffered centuries of state-mandated violence. And it didn't matter at all. The people of England were told that the Jews were ending the world, and they acted to prevent it. It was what a good Christian subject did in medieval England. The Jewish question was asked and answered for hundreds of years, and all those centuries of assumed prejudice set deep roots. So, when the conversation around Judaism just barely began to change in the 17th century, Christian conservatives fought it tooth and nail. Stories of Jews stealing away Christian babies in the night had been passed down as folklore for many years. Many of the people who told these stories had never and would never meet a Jew. Assumed prejudice was a part of their culture, a part of their history, and now the English government was defying the will of God. It didn't matter that the Naturalization Act was a little piece of procedural legislation that officially approved a thing that was already happening anyway. Jewish converts who kept their faith in secret had been merchants in England for more than a century by the time the act passed. They were already there. And it's not like this was the first step toward bringing Jews back into society either. The Plantation Act had allowed Jews on English soil in the colonies. But the homeland itself, according to contemporary Christian conservative writers, was different. It was a place designed for them and them alone by God on high, and if the blood-sucking, plague-carrying Jews were allowed to integrate into society, the world would literally end. The king, the final voice of authority in the English government, spoke for God by rule of law. The king and the government around him had the power to act on the belief that Jews were responsible for all the ills of society, and they did. For decades. Why should one little piece of paper change all that? The Naturalization Act led to chaos. There were no widespread massacres or royal edicts banning their existence like there had been for so many years, but the English public's reaction was venomous. Myths and rumors flew left and right across the public discourse, including one that might sound familiar to modern ears. There appears to have been a curious preoccupation in the popular literature with circumcision, as if in addition to their takeover of the land and the economy, the massive immigration that would result from conceding citizenship to the Jews would compromise the native Englishman's masculinity. The Naturalization Act was repealed just a year later, and the unrest did largely calm down. The slow integration of Jews into English society would continue, but the Jewish question was now unanswered for the first time in centuries. Times had changed. The days of complete, unquestioned, violent prejudice was no longer the norm. The government moved away, albeit slowly, from blaming the Jews for every problem England faced, but legally acknowledging that the Jews were equal people to them who deserved the same human rights and legal protections was unacceptable to the English populace. England was theirs. It did not and could not belong to the Jews. But by the time the government passed these laws, there had been Jews in England for a long time. They practiced their faith in secret to avoid the persecution their ancestors faced for so many years, but they were still there. They'd been there the whole time. This was their home too. If the world was going to end because of Jews in England, the world would have ended long before the Jewish Naturalization Act. Just because they weren't doing it in public didn't mean they weren't doing it. All the Naturalization Act meant was that the Jews who were already in Britain, and the few wealthy Jews abroad who had a large enough bank account to attract the eye of the English government, could do in public what they were already doing in private. It just meant that the Christian majority of England might have to see Jews living their lives in public. Maybe. They wouldn't even have to interact with them most of the time. And make no mistake, this was not a massive all-at-once push from the government to grant every Jew equal rights. This was, at most, somebody checking a different box on a piece of paper filed away somewhere nobody would ever see it. Jewish people did not cause the Black Plague. No matter how much the governments and church and people of Europe might have believed that they did, Jewish people did not cause the Black Plague. They did not stifle the righteous masculinity of the Englishmen. They did not destroy the proper English Christian way of life practiced by virtually everybody who held any shred of real power. Jews do not, and have never, secretly run a cabal of powerful elites who run the world away from moral Christian eyes. Even today, the Jewish population makes up a fraction of a percent of the British population. No matter how much the people believed that the Jews were coming to destroy their country in some way, shape, or form, they never did. They were just a convenient group for the majority to shove all their troubles on who had no way of fighting back. Do you think that Jewish people have the right to exist in your life free of prejudice? That is the Jewish question. Time and time again, the answer has been no. And when the answer turns ever so slightly towards a yes, the response is sharp and severe. When somebody with enough power to answer the Jewish question in the way he believed necessary to save the world from the imminent doom these people supposedly bore, he wiped out 6 million Jews. Adolf Hitler rose to his position of absolute authority in Germany by the will of the people. He was a popular demagogue, making rousing speeches about these long-held beliefs surrounding Jewish people that Europeans had heard for centuries. There was widespread discontent in Weimar Germany as Hitler rose to power, as a series of overlapping catastrophes had left the newly established democratic government shaken. The natural currency was worth more as kindling than it was for buying bread. The Treaty of Versailles laid the fault for the Great War largely at Germany's feet, incurring costs it couldn't pay. The country was bleeding, divided, and suffering. So when this charismatic hard-right activist showed up and said he had a simple solution to all their troubles, the German people raised him up. The more moderate conservatives in charge of the government at the time elevated him to a position of great power, thinking they could use him to further their own ends. They were wrong. The rumbling undercurrent of anti-Semitism that fueled the Nazi movement filtered out slowly. Little by little, one legal protection pulled away at a time, justifiable as protective measures. Vague distrust of Jews wasn't just a cultural norm anymore. It was the law. Adolf Hitler, who bravely assumed control of the government after the tragic burning of the Reichstag, said he could fix everything, but only if the German people obeyed the rule of law. Where else could the people of Germany turn? It's not like it was a huge change, not at first. The average German probably hardly met any Jews, let alone knew them personally. What could be the harm of moving them a little further away from the public eye? Bit by bit, one small step after another, the Nazis built on these vague fears and legends the Jews carried in Europe, using centuries of belief, doctrine, and learned experience to stoke the flames of anti-Semitism in Germany. By the time the Jews were packed up and shipped away to segregated ghettos, it just seemed like the natural thing to do. Out of sight, out of mind. Not everybody was enthusiastic about it, but nobody with any real power could or would do anything to stop what was coming. Genocides do not happen overnight. They are built on centuries of state-sponsored distrust and fear. The German people were not hypnotized into looking the other way while the Jews suffered and died en masse. The Nazis capitalized on a vulnerable political situation amid a contentious and challenging period in history and said they could fix everything if the answer to the Jewish question was no. The Holocaust did not happen because of a few bad apples making an evil scheme. The Holocaust happened because there was a Jewish question in the first place, and a Roma question, and a disabled question, and a gay question, and a transgender question. Those questions had been asked and answered. It was settled precedent for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years of assuming Jews to be evil on sight that had only faded slightly in recent history. Those myths and legends never went away. Ever hear that the Rothschilds run the world? We all know what the effects of the Holocaust looked like. It's the one genocide we're taught in schools around here, largely because the American army was instrumental in ending it. We're even taught the mechanics of how it happened. First, they were identified. Then their legal protections were stripped away bit by bit. Then they were segregated from the rest of society. Then they were imprisoned. And then they were exterminated. Every American learns this by the time they're 13. It is more discussed, examined, and well known than any other genocide in history. We all know this story, and yet we are incapable of recognizing it. The transgender question might seem small. An inert curiosity, a political problem to be debated like tax policy. According to UCLA, there are roughly 1.6 million trans people in the United States. In a country of 331 million people, odds are good your average American has never met a trans person face-to-face. And that's not a crime, that's just a statistical likelihood. But times are changing. 300,000 of those 1.6 million trans people are underage. Generation Z has access to more information at their fingertips than any other before them, and they've used that power to gain a greater understanding of gender than their parents ever had. Queer and trans people are more present now in America than they ever have been before, and that has flared up some worryingly familiar rhetoric. We are not on a one-way collision course with doom. The Reichstag is not burning, the Nazis do not have the wheel. But the potential looms large. Every day you see another story in the Atlantic or the New York Times telling worried suburban parents that what's happening to their child is dangerous and needs to be questioned. State legislatures across the country are proposing and often passing bills to ban drag and protect our children, when really what these bills do is make it legally impossible for trans people to exist within the view of the state. On March 4th, conservative commentator Michael Knowles took the stage at CPAC, an annual gathering of some of the most influential conservatives in America and their most loyal voters. A rally, if you will. During his appearance, Knowles said this: "There can be no middle way in dealing with transgenderism. It is all or nothing. If transgenderism is true, if men really can become women, then it's true for everybody of all ages. If transgenderism is false, as it is, if men really can't become women, as they cannot, then it's false for everybody too. And if it's false, then we should not indulge it, especially since that indulgence requires taking away the rights and customs of so many people. If it is false, then for the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen in prey to this confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level. Customs." There is zero evidence that transgenderism is harmful to children. In fact, quite the opposite. Here's a quote from Health and Human Services about healthcare for trans kids. "Medical and psychosocial gender-affirming healthcare practices have been demonstrated to yield lower rates of adverse mental health outcomes, build self-esteem, and improve overall quality of life for transgender and gender-diverse youth." Here's another from Scientific American. "The truth is that the data from more than a dozen studies of more than 30,000 transgender and gender-diverse young people consistently show that access to gender-affirming care is associated with better mental health outcomes, and that lack of access to such care is associated with higher rates of suicidality, depression, and self-harming behavior." The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the Endocrine Society, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Psychiatric Association all return the same verdict. Transgender healthcare helps children who are in need of it. Transgenderism is not the enemy. Transgenderism is a fact of life, and it always has been. Just because trans people are more visible now doesn't mean we haven't always been here. Just because you might have to see us at the grocery store or in a movie doesn't mean American society is in danger of some imminent moral collapse. Nothing has changed. We've always been here. We just don't have to hide like we used to because things have changed just enough that we can be ourselves like you do. Jews did not cause the Black Death. Bacteria from fleas did that. Armenians didn't beat the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The Allies did that. Ukrainians didn't cause the famine that sent the Soviet Union's population through the floor. Stalin and a civil war did that. Irish Catholics' improper worship did not cause the Blight. A fungus did that, and then the English government exported what food was left. Every single one of these genocides was built on centuries of oppression, control, and most of all, customs. These governments cracked down and imposed horrific violence on these populations, but what were the people to do? Not resist social contagion? It's okay. They probably come steal your children away for use in their unholy ceremonies anyway. Maybe everything is their fault. Sooner or later, the transgender question will need an answer. Michael Knowles thinks he has an answer, and he's not alone. A lot of people who hold substantial power agree with him. Nothing less than the complete removal of transgenderism will satisfy the crowds who applauded that proclamation. Do you honestly think they'll stop at banning public drag? What's happening right now is not a novel thing. When a minority population is questioned, horror follows unless we make a course correction. I need to say again, the train has not derailed, the situation is not hopeless, and we can still very much turn back. American voters largely rejected hard-right candidates last election season, and some states under Democratic control are hard at work passing further legal protections for the people who might be in danger if America decides the answer to the transgender question is no. But we are sitting on the edge of a long, dark road. People like Michael Knowles are making their goals and intentions clear. Transgenderism must be eradicated from society. Any practice of it in public life is an abomination against decency. They're coming to take away your children and convert them to their sick, twisted, perverted ideology. They don't care what the evidence says. They don't care that every relevant medical authority with an ounce of credibility says that gender-affirming care changes lives for the better. They believe that the very existence of trans people is an act against God, and they will only stop if one of two things happen. Transgenderism is eradicated, or we stop them. There are only two answers to the transgender question. Maybe is not an option. Either you believe that transgender people have the right to exist, or you don't. But we've seen what happens when the answer is no. You all learned about it in middle school. Stand with us. Please. We can't do this without you. Keep those who would oppress and destroy us away from the levers of power that would allow them to do so. The arc of history will only bend towards justice if we push it that way. And there are people trying very hard to push the arc of history right down on top of us. They aren't hiding what they want to do. They're saying it right out in the open because they're confident that the American people will just lie down and allow them to do what they wish. Ignoring this is not an option anymore. Once you crack the door to civil rights, it doesn't get shut again, at least not for long. Transgender people are becoming a bigger part of society at large with the same legal protections as everybody else. And you can no sooner eradicate transgender ideology than you can eradicate Judaism. They're broadcasting their goals through a loudspeaker, and they think that nobody will care enough to stop them. Care! The eyes of the future are watching us, teetering on the edge of self-inflicted catastrophe. They always say that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. Consider your answer to the transgender question carefully, and know what comes next if enough people answer no. These are the stakes.